Welcome to today's video lecture. In this video lecture, we'll discuss crafting effective PowerPoints. To get started, let's take a look at a sample PowerPoint slide. And as you look at this slide, I want you to ask yourself, what's wrong here? What's wrong with this slide? Trick question. Everything's wrong with it. It's got too much text. The contrast is poor. Darth Vader is blocking some of the most important information, and it's got a distracting background. It's just a bad slide. So how can we avoid this? We can avoid creating bad slides like this by following 15 rules for effective PowerPoints. Here's tip 1. You should be aware that most themes are rubbish. For a lot of us, the first thing that we do when we begin to create a PowerPoint presentation is to go look for a theme. If you do this, please break yourself of that habit as soon as possible. Themes have a number of critical problems. This theme, for instance, inexplicably puts the title at the bottom of the page, and it uses text with poor contrast. This theme has slightly stronger contrast, but it's got these random bubbles, and that's going to be inappropriate for virtually any presentation unless you're talking to either SodaStream or Coca-Cola. And then finally, we've got this random theme here with these circuits. And unless you're talking to a tech company whose company colors just happen to align with this theme, then this is going to be inappropriate. All right? So again, please break yourself of the habit of using themes. You are far better off with either a theme you create yourself or a plain, sleek presentation. Tip 2. Use color strategically and consistently. Your color scheme, not surprisingly, should align with the company that you're presenting on or the company that you're presenting to. If you're presenting to Amazon, your presentation should use a lot of black, a lot of white, and a lot of gold. If you're presenting to Walmart, your presentation should use a lot of blue, a lot of gold, and a lot of white, so on and so forth. Tip 3. Use contrasting colors. By using contrasting colors, you'll ensure that different elements of your presentation are easily distinguishable from one another. Now, how do you know what colors are contrasting? You can figure this out by looking at our old friend from high school art class, the color wheel. Contrasting colors are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. So yellow and purple are contrasting colors. Green and red are contrasting colors. And blue and orange are contrasting colors. Now, while you should use these contrasting colors, you should also avoid bright, garish, or distracting background colors. Lime green, not a good look for a background color. Same thing with neon magenta or burnt orange. These are background colors that will make your audience's eyes hurt. Avoid them at all costs. Next tip, use readable, professional system fonts. In other words, use a font that comes preloaded on most Windows or Apple computers. That will ensure that your presentation will look the same on the computer or device you're using for the presentation as it did on the computer or device where you designed your presentation. More specifically, I would encourage you to use sans serif fonts rather than serif fonts. And if you don't know the difference between these two font families, serif fonts are fonts that have serifs. Serifs are those little hooks or arrows that you find typically at the top or bottom of a lot of individual letters within various font families. And serif fonts are great for certain kinds of things. You'll notice, for instance, that most textbooks or novels use serif fonts for the body of those texts. And that's because serif fonts help speed your reader's eye, your audience's eye, across a line of text, which is great for a textbook or a novel. But for a slide deck, for a PowerPoint presentation, you actually want to slow your audience down. You want them to spend more time on each word, on each character, and therefore you use those sans serif fonts strategically. Tip 5. Use 45-point fonts for titles and 25-point fonts for additional text. This tip will ensure that your presentation, that your slide deck is as readable as possible, even for folks in the back of the room where you're presenting. Tip 6, and this is a huge one, have one main idea per slide. If you find yourself crafting a slide that has multiple ideas on it, it's beginning to look a bit packed and a bit crowded, break that slide up. It's always better to have more slides with fewer ideas and less content per slide than to have individual slides that are just packed and overloaded. Tip 7, limit your use of bullet points. Bullet points are one of the most important contributors to slide crowding. Okay? So minimize them, and by doing so, you will likely minimize the text on your page. Now, if you do need to use a bulleted list, by all means try to replace that bulleted list with a smart art list, which will at very least enhance contrast. Take a look at this list. It's basically just a bulleted list, but instead of using bullets, it uses smart art. And if you're new to smart art, you can find it under the Insert tab in PowerPoint. Tip 8, limit your text by following the 8x6 rule. The 8x6 rule basically says that no slide should have more than 8 words across and 6 words down. Now, this is not a rule for how much text every slide should have. It's a maximum. In general, you should be aiming to have significantly less text than what is permitted under the 8x6 rule. Tip 9, avoid short generic titles and text on your slides. You want to be concise with the text on your slides, but you don't want to be too concise. Instead, you want to use that valuable real estate to maximum effect. You want to use longer descriptive text that conveys your point. So instead of using something like problems or solutions as a header text on your PowerPoint, you want to use something like guidelines for effective lists, a fresh approach to our staffing challenge, etc., etc. That's going to give your audience a much stronger sense of what your slide and your presentation and your point are all about. Tip 10, use graphics thoughtfully and strategically. Pictures, as we discussed previously, are especially useful for evoking pathos, those appeals to emotion. This picture says far more about sustainable waste management practices than you ever could in either text or speech, right? Folks say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's true. The same thing goes for this picture. This can say something about animal cruelty or the need to protect dogs and cats than you could in a year of text. Similarly, prefer icons to clip art. Unless you're trying to evoke the look and feel of the 1990s in your PowerPoint presentation, you want to use those far more modern looking icons and leave the clip art in the dustbin of history. Tip 11, make charts and graphs simple and easy to understand. You can do this by minimizing numbers and text and also by highlighting key takeaways. If you do include a chart or graph in your presentation, I want it to look something like this. It should have a title, You should label your axes, and you should use additional content to label the key point or key takeaway, but don't overburden your audience with unnecessary numbers or text. Tip 12, control the flow of information. If you've got a lot of content on a slide and you want your audience to navigate that content in a particular order or at a particular time, make sure that you're using the tools at your disposal to achieve that. If you don't control the flow of information, people might read ahead. That might generate misunderstanding or misinterpretations, and it might, under certain circumstances, lead to incorrect conclusions. One of the best ways to control the flow of information, particularly if you've got a smart art list, is by using the appear animation. And we can talk more offline about how to use that appear animation effectively. Tip 13, balance your slides and be consistent with your alignment. Generally speaking, your slides should be basically symmetrical on at least one axis. You'll notice that most of my slides are not symmetrical on the horizontal axis, but they are symmetrical vertically. And because they're symmetrical on at least one axis, they feel basically balanced to the audience. You should also align your text consistently within each slide and ideally throughout your presentation. And you can either align your text on the left, on the right, or in the center. I tend to prefer left alignment for a lot of my slides, but that's really just a personal preference. Tip 14, be consistent with the look and the feel of your slides. One of the best ways to achieve this is by limiting yourself to 4 or 5 basic slide designs per deck. You don't want all of your slides to look exactly the same, but you don't want to have too many different slide design templates because then your deck feels very disjointed. It lacks cohesion and coherence. And then lastly, tip 15, minimize slide content to prevent your slides from feeling crowded. And one of the best ways that you can do this is by maximizing white space, which will enhance readability. Oftentimes we think of blank space as a waste, but actually white space is it is an essential design element. So make sure that you're using it thoughtfully and strategically. And that brings us to the end of our 15 rules for effective PowerPoints. Thanks, as always, for tuning in.